What are the challenges in SD-WAN and things that need to be standardized? So today we have our panelists read the bios online just since we got started a little bit late, but Mark Gibson here from Amdocs and Aloke Tusnial from NEC Netcracker. So we're going to have a really good session here. And what we want to focus on is not necessarily standards from the standpoint of I need a standard specification, but what are some of the things that would actually make deploying SD-WAN services, operating SD-WAN services, and managing SD-WAN services? What would make it easier? And then also, if you have other services in conjunction with SD-WAN that you want to onboard, what things could be standardized either from the form of a standard spec or best practices or things like that that would actually facilitate again, focusing from a business perspective, what actually reduces cost, accelerates time to market, et cetera. Okay, so one of the things I just wanted to start off with is the MEF SD-WAN service definition. We're focusing on that now. We're in our second call for comment ballot on that just went out yesterday, I believe. And the way MEF defines SD-WAN services, there's some fundamental capabilities of SD-WAN. Number one is the service runs on top of any type of underlay WAN service. So for example, an SD-WAN service can run over an MPLS network, it could run over a carrier Ethernet network, it could run over a layer 1 network, a LTE network, for example. So any type of technology underlay, it can run over. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two is it can run over any service provider's network. So it's technology independent for the underlay, but also operator independent because it's an overlay over the top service. So for example, I could have for example, my MPLS is from AT&T, my broadband is from Comcast, and my LTE is from Verizon Wireless, and I can bond those together and build an SD-WAN service. So the MEF service definition allows, the different underlay technologies and different service providers. The third thing is it's application aware. And what we mean by that is that the service recognizes either categories, individual applications, or groupings of applications. So let me give you an example. The service would be able to recognize, for example, running a GoToMeeting application, literally a GoToMeeting, or I'm running a Skype application and be able to apply policies to that. Or groupings of applications, so all voice over IP or all conferencing apps. Okay, that's three. The fourth thing is I talked a little bit about setting policies. And so it's policy-based networking, and those policies could be how you either forward or block the applications. So do I send traffic over the WAN that's a public network, like the internet, even though it's encrypted? Or do I send it only over maybe the MPLS network, for example? And then the fourth thing is having built-in encryption and security as part of the service. So with all of these different types of fundamental capabilities, the MEF definition for an SD-WAN service makes it much different than, let's say, your classical connectivity services like MPLS and carrier Ethernet. So with that, if you want to read a little bit, I just wrote a blog on this the other day, and I have an article in Light Reading that was published the other day that kind of covers what I just talked about. But what I'd like to do is now open it up to the panelists, and just for starting off with, where do you see, in the areas that you focus on, the areas that, based on your customer interaction, which areas would really maybe pick the top one or two that if they were solved, you could see, some major business challenges solved.
I mean, I think the, as you said, the initial focus of the spec has been to look at the over-the-top services. I think maybe the next phase, and the next phase we're going to look at in the committee is to see how you integrate those together with other carrier offered services. And again, you start to then get into those kind of cross-domain orchestration capabilities, and how do you kind of tie things together. So I think one of the interesting next phases is going to be to see how do you start to integrate between SD-WAN services and the underlays that they're going on top of, and what's the right level of coupling, and how do you solve that? Because I think in solving that kind of problem. You kind of unpack some, some interesting conversations about how services relate to one another and how they interrelate to each other. So I think that's a very interesting next phase.
So if I were to paraphrase this, so this would be coupling between the overlay SD-WAN service and the underlay WAN services that it operates over,
Yeah.
and be able to have some kind of a linkage between that.
Yeah, and I think to define, what is a sensible linkage for that? How do you describe that? How do you define that? What does the policy look and feel like? And how do you make sensible decisions between the layers? Because you want to kind of avoid one layer overreacting when the other layer is kind of dealing with it. So how do you solve that kind of that kind of conversation between the layers, if they're layers or if they're kind of verticals? I think that's a very interesting next phase to get into.
Yeah, I think just before I'll pass it to Aloke in a moment. As an SD-WAN service provider, one of the things that we found is, one of the other pieces I forgot to mention was an SD-WAN service does measure the performance of the underlay network to make policy-based forwarding decisions. So it's measuring all the underlays to determine which is the best one based on a QoS policy, for example. One of the things that we found as a service provider is we don't need a linkage. We're an over-the-top service provider. We don't need a linkage between the overlay and the underlay from the standpoint of, we view the underlay as something that doesn't change very rapidly. So, if you buy a carrier Ethernet circuit or you're buying a broadband circuit, that'll be fixed for some period of time, maybe 6 months, a year, or 2 years, depending on what your service contract is. So it'll be that. But what we do find though is from a trouble ticketing perspective, and this is probably more on the on the Sonata API business side, we actually monitor all the underlays from all the service providers. So being able to have a standard way we can send out a trouble ticket to all the many underlay WAN service providers that we work with, we would see that standardizing. That would be great, because right now I have to do unique ticketing systems for every single underlay provider.
And I think this is, sorry, just to, but I mean, it just raises something I've heard in the past as well, where people will buy, deliberately set out to buy connections from 2 different providers, and they just kind of want to know when one's down so they can swap across. They buy them for full redundancy, and be able to encode that into SD-WAN so you can get that, whatever it needs to be, whether you're measuring it over the top or whether you're getting, information back to say, look, we're kind of down or we've rerouted or we've done, whatever, so that you can then make that decision to move across to the other path, which you've proactively bought, but you don't know to switch to because you haven't been able to detect it. I think that's,
yeah, and I think I would argue that's like a fundamental capability of an SD-WAN service, right? To be able to, if you have multiple WANs, the ability to seamlessly switch over. So let's say maybe you had issues with your MPLS. It might not be a blackout, a complete failure. Maybe it's just a brownout where you had a high amount of packet delay, for example, because there were some issues in the network. Being able to switch over dynamically and then switch back when the other service becomes within the SLA parameters. But let me pass to Aloke. So what are some of the issues that you're seeing?
Thanks, Ralph. So what I just heard from you and from Mark are both what can we do from a technical perspective, right? And how we can evolve SD-WAN more and combine it with security, combine it with the underlay, and take it further. I think SD-WAN is dealing with a much more basic issue than taking it, enhancing it from a technical perspective, which is making it relevant from a business perspective, right? So the industry is still trying to figure out, its claim to fame is that you can put it on broadband, you can put it on MPLS, you can put it on any kind of access, and then be able to move things across, right? But the challenge is at what cost? And what does it take? How do you simplify this? How do you convince, and you being a service provider yourself that is providing over-the-top services to customers, right? Almost competing with communication service providers. In such a situation, what is that marriage? When you look at, again, from a standards perspective, if I think of something, standardizing something, yes, you do need to do technical standardization, but I think it's time we start looking at what do we need to do from a licensing perspective, from a business consumption perspective, even as the over-the-top starts playing out, what are the areas that it starts really making sense to the customers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I've had a lot of discussions, maybe debates, if you want to call that, of when people say, well, what is an SD-WAN service? And that's why I think it's so valuable for the MEF to be able to define that service and what are the core minimum capabilities of that. But at the end of the day, it's back to business, who benefits the business value. So one of the discussions went along the lines, if I apply SDN types of concepts or NFV concepts to a WAN service, and I get all the automation and zero touch and dynamicism of that, does that really benefit the consumer of the service, right? Not, maybe not, depends. If it's priced differently, then it does, but that's maybe more of a benefit for the service provider, and that's okay, because that's always a good thing. But if the service, that's all it does is automation, and it doesn't do anything more value, and that's why SD-WAN being application aware, unlike other connectivity services that, packets are packets, bits in, bits out, right? Versus, I can now treat your Cisco phone application or your GoToMeeting or your Skype, I can treat it so that, because that's really at the end of the day, the enterprise consumers are more interested in making sure their applications work. Not their packets will have to be treated appropriately, but they don't care about packets. People care about applications.
Right, and actually, to add to that, you can't look at SD-WAN as a one-size-fits-all, right? What we've seen with various, we work primarily with communication service providers, right? And as part of what we've seen as part of the implementations with CSPs is that their customers, and similarly your customers, right? When you're looking at enterprises versus small, medium businesses, the requirements are very different. So when you're looking at standardizing SD-WAN and what capabilities you standardize, you also need to look at what are the customers who are actually consuming those services. So if you're dealing with a large enterprise, and I heard in the last session we're talking about banks as an example. You talk about banks, they'll say, fine, I'm okay with an SD-WAN, don't touch my security. Right? Just use my SD-WAN as a way for me to read out traffic based on application, but I want to keep my security separate. Right? I don't want security to be merged with my applications or my SD-WAN capability. On the other hand, if you go with an SMB, the SMB would say, security is a given. Why are you even asking me? Right? That should be part of the SD-WAN service. That should be part of the capability. Why do I even need to worry about security? Right? So very, very different requirements on the same set of services, depending on the customer profile.
And I think this is one of the interesting areas for MEF moving forward, is to think about how those different kind of silos interact. How do you kind of stack them up? And and we've been very careful in the SD-WAN specification to just focus on that SD-WAN piece as a kind of a starting point. But yeah, you're right. How do you add security into that? Is it kind of a complete tied in thing, or is it is it an add-on extra? And how do you do you even think about monetizing it? Dare we say, or I think there's a whole kind of bunch of things which are add-on features and functions which you still have to kind of coordinate between. At the end of the day, there's still a virtual function kind of sitting on a UCP somewhere which is doing something, and you have to figure out how do I define the relationship between the components which are delivering that service. But being able to make it hit the right different markets that you want to hit, I think is pretty important.
Sorry, one more thing. Since you brought this up again, looking at examples of UCP, right? Yes, it's a dream that we'll have UCPs and we'll put UCPs in there. Question is, do you standardize that, and how do you standardize that, and what do you bring in there? Do you go with the latest example that, and now I'll use Cisco here, but if you go with the latest example, what Cisco said, right? They went and bought Viptela, and they said, okay, all my ASRs are now Viptela. You can put Viptela software on that, and they become SD-WAN boxes. Why bother with UCPs? So when you start looking at UCPs and you start and you want to put different VNFs on there, and again, talking about standards, do you put VNFs in there or do you put containers in there? And how do you get that moving? How do you get to a point where me as a consumer, or whether I'm an SMB or an enterprise, don't have to go through all of these decision points and still am able to make my price point work better than going and buying a box that I can buy today, right? So ultimately, it becomes a cost discussion as well. Yes, there is probably incremental benefit going SD-WAN. Question is at what cost, right? Do I get cost savings, or is it an incremental cost to what I'm paying today for my connectivity? And if it is an incremental cost, how is it helping me, right? What is the value that that cost brings? And so you need to start bringing that together and defining, making an ROI analysis or a cost-benefit analysis to say, yes, this is how SD-WAN will actually make sense for customers, and therefore these are the areas that we need to standardize, looking at from a monetary perspective, from a business perspective. I think technically we are almost there. There's a lot of work that has happened. It's more on the business side that it's still struggling.
Yeah, I think getting back to that point on UCPE, so there's the choice, and we come across this all the time where you know, do you use the SD-WAN vendor's CPE because you get zero-touch provisioning, zero-touch configuration. You plug it in, it phones home to its orchestrator, grabs its config, et cetera. So it could be customer self-installed. Now, we also have situations where we actually put an SD-WAN Edge VNF either in a cloud or on a UCPE, and I think an area for standardization, we do all the customization work because I run a consulting practice as well, so we can go customize that. But the thing is, having a framework, maybe not saying specifically what interfaces there are, but having here's a cloud init file written in a standard way, so that all the vendors, if they use that, that gives you sort of this, when it boots up in a UCPE, VCP environment, it knows it can reach a point where it can then connect to the internet and then come back and phone home to its orchestrator to grab its config. So that's an area where maybe it's not, quote, standardization, it's more best practices. But if you can get something like that, that would really help on the service provider side to automate a lot of those processes.
And I wonder if, also in that process, you could start to make that U a little bit bigger at the front of UCPE. I kind of wonder sometimes if it's very small because they're not really that universal, but if we could start to drive standards to get the SD-WAN components to be a little more plug and play, even if not fully plug and play is probably a panacea we'll never reach. But if you can start to plug and play, then back to your comment, you can start to, the market then starts to form around the components rather than the actual service itself, and you start to deal with, being able to standardize how the components of an SD-WAN service, play together. And there's probably good reason to keep functional blocks together, but if you could put security next to the kind of the forwarding components next to something else, then you could start to see it being a much more plug and play solution, and I think that would just benefit everyone. It would.
Yeah, in fact, so another fundamental capability of an SD-WAN service is having a local internet breakout. If you think about an or where enterprises are moving their applications from being on net, inside the building or inside their own private data center, moving more to a SaaS consumption model. They'll get Salesforce.com, great example, Office 365. So now, you have to make a choice. Does that application go over the SD-WAN on the SD-WAN, or does it branch off to local internet breakout to go over the public internet to reach that SaaS, that SaaS provider, right? And so this gets back to a thing I think both of you were mentioning. Security is kind of an integral feature. It has to be an integral feature of an SD-WAN service, because once you go over the internet, you need a firewall, number one. Number two is you want to encrypt your traffic. So those are kind of, again, part of the MEF service definition. But the other piece of it is when you say local internet breakout, you also want to, maybe you break out locally because that gives you the best performance, or maybe you go to another location and do a local breakout there over the SD-WAN. because then maybe because that might give you better, lower latency running over the SD-WAN, popping out at a local internet breakout at a remote location because it's physically, geographically closer to the server, and so you're on your encrypted network, you pop off and then go over that. So I wanted to maybe bring up in terms of that perspective, internet breakout, areas of standardization, or just, any thoughts there?
I mean, I think for me, internet breakout's almost one of the key differentiators for SD-WAN. That ability to deploy quickly onto an enterprise network, and then be able to kind of backfill that with additional, connectivity. I think is, for me, when I first saw SD-WAN delivered that, for me it seemed like a no-brainer. That ability as a service provider to be able to, to push out the service on whatever infrastructure there is, and then fill in the infrastructure, behind that. Yeah, it just seems like a win-win for everyone. Rather than and having worked on this in the past, having kind of a 2-3 month lead time to figure out if you've got the right fiber in the ground to be able to connect the Ethernet to somewhere near the customer to be able to then do the last little bit. If they have internet already, why not just use that as their as their baseline, and then build out on top of that as you go. So I think, for me, internet breakout's almost one of the key differentiators for SD-WAN. That ability to just get going and deliver people service now, because let's face it, we have a service now culture. We want to press a button, we want it to work, and and SD-WAN really delivers on that.
So to me, internet breakout is not new, right? It's been there forever. So yes, we can leverage SD-WAN for that as well. The question again comes back is, when you do internet breakout, what do you do with the security, right? Does that open up, especially if you're routing it using SD-WAN capabilities, is it opening you up for security vulnerabilities or attacks? Or are you putting in security in there? Again, looking at, as I said, looking at the different customer segments, right? There are segments that say, leave my security alone. They would probably want to continue to have their cloud access separated out. They may or may not want SD-WAN to be playing out there. On the other hand, for SMBs, it's a perfect solution, right? So depending on customer base, depending on the direction you go, the standardization that we need to do, number one, it needs to look at the customer segment. And number two, it needs to look at, am I stifling innovation or am I actually helping innovation, right? So I like what you said about not necessarily having standards, but more best practices. I think best practices are what would probably go forward much longer or much further, because there's still an area there where there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen, and it continues to happen. And it's a fine line between best practice and standard, where you start defining, okay, do I support innovation or do I curb innovation, right? I think that's what's going to help move things forward. So best practices probably is where we should be spending more time as we take this further.
Well, I have one more topic, but we have a little bit of time left. Is there anyone from the audience that has a question they would like to ask the panelists? Don't be shy. There's no such thing as a bad question. Here's our brave person coming up here. All right.
I'll open the debate. Gibson from Verizon. One of the challenges we see sometimes when we deploy SD-WAN is that migration phase, when you start with a legacy network and you want to move to SD-WAN. Half your location might be on SD-WAN, the other half might not be on SD-WAN. You might be deploying in location where SD-WAN might not be available for different regulation rules. Some application will never run over SD-WAN the way they are designed or deployed. So you have this environment where part of your network migrate, the other part did not migrate. And many of the vendors we're working with, they seem to be looking at that a little bit lightly or tangentially, not really putting a lot of focus on. What's your experience with that, type of situation that might be faced as we migrate toward SD-WAN?
Yeah, so if I paraphrase correctly, let me see if I can. There were a couple of questions buried in there. So one was migrating your network to support SD-WAN, I thought was one in there, and applications not
so
being
what
supported.
happened is the question is more on being in a situation where part of your location migrate to SD-WAN, the other location have not migrated to SD-WAN, right. And then how to communicate between them. Right. When you have this environment where not all your network migrated to SD-WAN, or when you're running some applications that will not be able to run over SD-WAN by the way they were designed. So now you're running this hybrid network of some application SD-WAN, some of them not, some location SD-WAN, some of them not, and how to now communicate between the overlay and the underlay when some of the location have moved and some have not.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, and it actually applies as you're rolling out your SD-WAN service. You can't roll out, let's say I have a 1,000 site SD-WAN deployment. I can't roll out 1,000 sites instantly, right? So I'm going to bring up some sites, and how do I make sure that that site still connects, right? So the sites will have some type of connectivity, and so usually the sites, so then what you're talking about is more of a gateway. So can I connect my SD-WAN sites to my existing MPLS network that does not have SD-WAN edges? So I have sort of a gateway function to be able to do that. It's kind of one technique. The other technique is to kind of home into a lot of sites or a lot of deployments are kind of hub and spoke type of topologies, and where you actually you bring in you make sure that your hub always is SD-WAN enabled as you bring in your spokes, which you slowly enable your SD-WAN as well. But there's lots of different ways of doing that depending on the network topology and et cetera. Basil has a question here. Good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ralph. Thanks for this great topic. My comment/questions around the management model. So sometimes it's like the subscriber wants to manage everything from A to Z. There's a co-managed model and or fully managed by the service provider. That could be the overlay service provider or underlay service provider. It all depends on the model. So my question around this standardization, do you think this is one of the topics that we need to standardize, or we go with the best practice model type of
yeah, so let me just paraphrase. So you're talking about the management portal of the SD-WAN service
itself,
and versus fully managed by the service provider or co-managed by allowing the enterprise subscriber to actually make changes to the service. So
to the policy.
This is the business that these guys are in. So it's good.
During the life cycle of the service itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough.
No, good question.
So this is a great question, right? In fact, if you look at the optimal management of your network, or especially on SD-WAN, can very quickly become the differentiator between a successful SD-WAN deployment or a complete failure. Right. In fact, 2 weeks ago we were at Hague, Den Haag, for the SDN World Congress, and one of the comments we had was from one of our customers that after $30 million of investment and 2 years of deployment of SD-WAN, they had 2 customers. Why? Because they didn't have any management. Their management layer sucked. They fixed the management layer, and in 4 months they had 200 customers. Right, so that's the power of having the right management layer, because you are then providing this to providing the control to your customers. Right, the technical capabilities are great, but if I can't use it, if I cannot manage it, and if I need to put in a massive team of IT to run this, it's going to be a disaster. So your question was, should it be standardized, or do you put best practices on it? This is an area that is really evolving, and there's a lot to go in there, and there's a lot of innovation that needs to come in to define what's the real power of that management, and how much should it go to the customers, and that depends on whether you're an SMB or an enterprise. Or a SOHO, right, who's using this capability, and how much do they want versus how much do they want to hand over or give power to the CSPs, right? Are you buying a managed services, or are you taking it all by yourself? And that defines the kind of capability you need. I think in this situation, the best practices are what defines it best, and there's a lot of different points in the spectrum that basically defines on how much capability or how much flexibility you want to give to the enterprise or to the customer. Because that would, again, flexibility is equivalent to complexity, right? The more flexibility you provide, more complex you make it. The more complex you make it, the less usable you make it, right? So everybody loves flexibility, nobody likes complexity. And you want to be able to create a nice balance between that. You try and standardize that, and it'll be a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to just draw a parallel between this and what MEF is trying to do in terms of the API definitions, agility, being able to process all the changes, because one of the key aspects of the management is how to manage the MACDs or the changes. That's what I was trying to figure out, and maybe there is a linkage here we can create.
Yeah,
But
so we're
thank
gonna-
you, that was really
Yeah,
great.
so
Thank you.
we're out of time, so